Hello, and welcome to NCSL's webinar on election mis, dis, and malinformation. I'm Mandy Zach, the Elections Project Manager with NCSL's Elections and Redistricting team. So you can't read the news without encountering some story about election mis, dis, and malinformation, or MDM as it often gets called. So there's MDM, there's responses to MDM, stories about MDM, tips for how to respond to MDM. It's really everywhere these days if you are paying attention. And in the lead up to an election, it's incredibly important for anyone in the election space, not just legislators, despite what the title of this webinar is, to be able to identify, understand, and effectively respond to MDM. So that's what we're talking about today. And joining us are Matt Masterson and Colin Eide. So Matt is well known to many in the elections world. Before joining Microsoft as the Director of Information Integrity, he was a senior cybersecurity advisor at the Department of Homeland Security and a commissioner on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Colin is a senior manager at Microsoft's Digital Threat Analysis Center, or DTAC. He leads DTAC's analyst teams covering nation-state influence operations in the Middle East, South America, and Africa. So prior to Microsoft, Colin worked on issues related to extremism and conflict zones in the Middle East. So here's the plan. In just a moment, I am going to hand this over to Matt, who will discuss the information environment surrounding elections. Then Colin will follow up with a focus on international threats. We'll end with plenty of time for questions, hoping to end at about 1:45. So as you have questions that float through your brain, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Matt, you can take it away.
Thank you, Mandy, and I'm going to try to share my screen here so that we can present the information. There we go. Mandy, just give me a thumbs up when you see that screen. Just so got it. Perfect. So really appreciate this opportunity to present to NCSL. I've had the privilege of working with NCSL for a big chunk of my career, and with the elections team specifically. And the information and support that the elections team at NCSL provides to the members is tremendous. And so just appreciative of the opportunity to talk through this issue here today. It's certainly on the forefront of the minds of state and local election officials across the country as they prepare for the upcoming federal general election, and really has been part of their thought process, their work, since 2016 and throughout 2018 and 2020. And so the goals here are three main goals that Colin and I hope to share with you today. One is, as Mandy said, to talk about sort of the information environment, but more importantly, the context of the information environment and how legislators and staff might be able to engage, understand, and support state and local election officials of any party as they prepare to run the midterms and then the aftermath of the midterm election. The second is to provide some threat context around that information environment. As we saw in 2016, 2018, 2020, our adversaries have taken a keen interest in the information environment surrounding our elections, our democracy, our democratic institutions. And so ensuring that folks at NCSL, both legislators and staff, have this kind of context is really critically important as we head into the midterm cycle. And then finally, providing some suggestions, some feedback, some approaches that might be useful for members of NCSL to use to engage in their communities. The reality is legislators in particular are trusted voices within their communities, right? Locally elected officials that engage regularly out in the community. And so your voice really matters. And we want to be sure that we try to address some steps that could be taken by you, some of which you're probably already doing to engage your community in and around supporting our democracy. So to start, and I'll be very brief on this, Microsoft and the Democracy Forward initiative, which I'm a part of, kind of looks at this in three buckets. The first is supporting open and secure democratic processes. This really gets down to the nitty-gritty technical support that we're able to provide to state and local election officials, candidates, campaigns, as well as sort of periphery groups that support it, like NGOs. We provide advanced protection, cybersecurity reporting, things like that to those groups, to election officials, to campaigns and candidates that use Microsoft products, all free. This is not a sales pitch in any way, shape, or form, but the goal is part of rebutting or responding to narratives in and around our elections is to ensure that we can demonstrably prove the security of the elections process. And that includes Microsoft providing that kind of support, whether it's multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, a variety of things. I'll say that a number of tech companies provide this type of support to both election officials and campaigns. We're not unique, and so we're proud to work with the community across the board. The second is the healthy information ecosystem, which we'll talk about today. How to promote authoritative sources like state election websites, right? Secretaries of state, state election directors, so that voters know where to go to receive information about elections, whether it's at the state or local level, and are getting the information they need to understand how to vote, where to vote, what steps are involved in the process to secure the vote, items like that. And then finally is our corporate responsibility, which is more internally Microsoft focused in support to Microsoft. One need not, and Mandy mentioned this, look beyond the headlines to know that our democracy is in the conversation. I've been in elections since 2006, and I've never seen our democracy more in the conversation in the headlines, whether it be about actual election processes, election systems. I used to test and certify voting systems, and there used to be about 15 of us that paid any kind of attention to that. That has certainly changed in the last several years, and it's a good thing. It's healthy. It's healthy for us to ask questions and engage in conversations about our democracy, about the systems that support democracy, about the types of evidence that is available, about the integrity, security, and accessibility of our elections, but understanding where that information comes from, how we get that information, engaging with state and local election officials is really critically important. And there are three buckets that, as we talk through sort of the information environment, as Colin talks about, the threats from our adversaries and others, there are three main buckets that I want everyone to keep in mind, that all 50 states and the 5 territories across the state and local level have with regard to their elections. The first is that elections in the United States are transparent. There are laws across all 50 states, the 5 territories, requiring transparency around the process, whether that's watching pre-election testing of systems, the open availability for watchers at the polls, or for observation of the tabulation process or post-election audits. There are transparency requirements in all 50 states. They may differ state by state, depending on how states run elections, who runs elections in those states, but all 50 states have transparency requirements. The second is that our elections are bipartisan or multi-partisan. All 50 states, the 5 territories, have requirements for the involvement of partisan organizations, the political parties, their watchers, their assigned observers to participate, to watch, to be involved in the process. And that's really critically important because everyone wants to know that they're representing that room in some way, shape, or form. And so whether it's the bipartisan auditing boards that Arizona has, or my home state of Ohio, which requires basically every election function within an election office to be carried out by a Democrat and Republican together, there are a myriad of requirements across the 50 states for the involvement of partisan organizations and bipartisan involvement in the process, which is really important. And then the third and perhaps most important bucket is that elections are run by professionals. Mandy and I have the privilege of working with these folks day in and day out, and state and local election officials don't just wake up on a Tuesday in November and decide today's the day that I'm going to run an election. This seems like a good day to do this. They in fact spend all their time, all their energy thinking about how to run that election, what could go wrong, how do I prepare for what could go wrong, how do I engage the community, how do I ensure that that polling place is accessible for voters with disabilities, how will we conduct this post-election audit and make sure we offer the required amount of transparency and bipartisan involvement. Election officials are natural risk managers and contingency planners, and they spend day in and day out really prepping, preparing, and responding to new challenges so that they can offer a process that is secure, that is accessible, and has integrity. And so the reason we run elections at the state and local level in the United States is so that people can engage directly with the people that run the process, and they take that responsibility within their community very, very seriously. So those are the three buckets: transparency, bipartisanship or multi-partisanship, and then professional election officials. And just keep those in mind as we talk through some of these. As we look at sort of the formation and spread of election misinformation, this is a product that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency put out in 2018, I think, 2019, that kind of looked at the 5 steps of foreign interference. Attempted to boil down how sort of influence operations work, I'll be honest, this doesn't have to be foreign interference. It's not tied to a particular actor. This points to Russia. These are just 5 typical steps that, as Colin describes, sort of some activity from adversaries later in this briefing, you'll kind of recognize some of those steps in his briefing, in his portion of the briefing, because it's not new, right? These information operations, this type of interference has evolved over time. Technology has certainly played a very big role in how folks are targeted, how the information spread, but the tactics, techniques, thought process has been honed and sort of refined over time. And it starts by identifying a divisive or multiple divisive issues, right? How do we get people stirred up? How do we get people engaged? How do we get them to participate? And it's really important. Kate Starbird at the University of Washington frequently says that information operations are participatory in nature, right? If it's just one person kind of spreading a narrative with no interaction, it's not going anywhere. It certainly won't go viral. And so understanding what's going to get people ginned up, in this case, CISA utilized what I consider to be one of the most divisive issues our nation has faced, and that is whether or not pineapple belongs on pizza. For my view, pineapple absolutely does not belong on pizza, and those who support pineapple on pizza are likely supporting our adversaries. But that's one man's opinion of the issue. After we've identified that divisive issue, pineapple on pizza, we move to sort of getting accounts or getting channels in place, right? How do we get this information out? How do we spread the messaging, the narrative that we want to get out there? How do we take both sides of the issue, right? It's not just about supporting, one side, pineapple on, pineapple off, but really ginning up a fervor amongst people to engage in this content. Once we kind of have those messaging points in place and we're ready to share, how do we amplify and distort the conversation, right? How do we give the appearance of legitimacy to the narrative to start so that people will begin to engage and then begin to turn the conversation into the narratives that we want people to engage in, that we want people to participate in, while maintaining that energy, that responsiveness to the content, because in the end, we want to get to step 4. It's really the critical part, which is making that narrative mainstream, taking it from channels on social media platforms or other places and driving it into the mainstream narrative of conversation through traditional media sources and other approaches, including messengers, so that people are further exposed, more broadly exposed to this information. So it's not enough just to gin up that conversation within certain, social media channels or somewhere else. You've really got to take it to the next level by trying to find avenues to drive it mainstream. And what mainstream means can change or adapt. Certainly, we know our adversaries have created their own mainstream news, right, where they're driving their own narratives through their own channels. But uptick in consumption of that information we're seeing is getting higher and higher in certain populations, in part because people are ginned up on that issue and want to pursue it down those paths of information. And then finally, taking the conversation in the real world, getting organization, getting people to actually put boots on the ground or money behind a particular narrative or cause in order to pursue the outcomes that folks want. And certainly we saw, for instance, in 2016, where the Russians were able to get Americans to organize protests on the same days at the same place on opposite sides of racial and gender equality issues, simply by getting people ginned up and engaged and then getting them to take the action to the streets. So that's the core concepts behind it. And again, you'll see these reflected in some of the conversation that Colin has around threat. So if we look at, and this from the 2020 election, but this is really in general just meant to give you kind of how things tend to play out in the information space in elections. And what tends to happen is narratives are started sometimes more than a year in advance, even longer. Sometimes they're long established narratives, and they're decentralized and one-off incidents in the lead up to. In this time period, just before October, before a November election, they're one-off claims. We saw in 2020 claims of Ivanka Trump creating voting systems, claims of ballots being disposed or dumped, right? Just whatever kind of one-off issues or incidents, little pieces of evidence that can be taken out of context or driven to drive a particular narrative, but nothing focused on a particular state, race, jurisdiction at that time. As we build into and around, and again, this is 2000, so November 3rd, that would be of 2020. But as we drive towards election day, more and more specificity begins to come into these narratives. More and more anecdotes of evidence specific to jurisdictions or places begin to be used to drive conversations about specific narratives, whether it's trust in the systems, trust in the process, trust in the officials, trust in the candidates. They're really beginning to hone in on people, places, and things to drive specific narratives. And then once we get into the post-election time period, that's really where, depending what happens, depending what results take place, depending what incidents or issues are encountered, every election has issues. That's the nature of a human-driven process. Those are honed in and used to say, see, we told you. The process can't be trusted. The system can't be trusted. The person running the process can't be trusted. And here's evidence of that. And I'll give you a very specific example here in just a second of that. And so these narratives are driven both top down and bottom up. Again, the driving of narratives is participatory, and this graphic and this information over the next several slides comes from something called the Election Integrity Partnership, which tracks and identifies narratives in and around elections that can take hold and drive conversations. And so, yes, sometimes it's larger messengers on social media driving specific narratives, but a lot of times it's people out engaging with that content saying, see, I found this piece of evidence, or see, I found this piece of information, driving it up to larger influencers who are then able to take and use that to drive larger conversations to say, see, we warned you about this. Here's a specific incident from this specific state that says that it took place. And this is happening broadly across the process, not just in this one place. And so it feeds itself, right? And this is research that again, the Election Integrity Partnership, University of Washington, Kate Starboard have done really interesting look. So I wanted to do a specific example, and it's one that should be familiar from 2020. I stuck with it. There are new narratives with 2022 that could have been pulled, but I use this one because it's familiar to folks and I think easier to explain. Again, all credit to EIP, Stanford, Graphica for the work at looking at this. But Sharpiegate was a narrative that we saw in 2020, and Sharpiegate was a narrative that basically said that the use of Sharpies specifically starting in Maricopa County led to the sort of intentional changing of votes or rigging of the election through the use of the writing implement, which is not true. In fact, Sharpies were the intended device, are the ones tested and certified for that specific voting system. But the way that this emerged is a perfect example of bottom-up sort of narratives driving a conversation. So it started with a relatively innocuous tweet that we could see here, where a citizen, understandably, was just concerned about bleed through on their ballot. This is something that election officials deal with all the time. Questions about, should I worry about bleed through? I colored outside the circle. Is that going to affect my vote? Like, what writing should it have been, a pencil instead of it? These are common questions for state and local election officials that they get hundreds of times in the lead up to and on election day as they deal with it. And so Maricopa County, where this question was raised, did what election officials do, which is answer, respond, wants to be engaged with their constituency. And so they say, look, we use Sharpies. We understand the concern, but this is actually the design of the system such that the bleed through won't impact it. Your vote's good. You can have confidence in the process. And that's fairly typical for an election organization to respond in that way, to offer the information and kind of move forward. Except in this case, there wasn't the ability to move forward despite the response. And if you kind of look at the beginning of this graph at the bottom, you see sort of the initial bubbles or bottoms of the use of the phrase Sharpie on Twitter. And you can see sort of the initial bumps where Maricopa County responded, engaged, and kind of thought, okay, this is handled. But then you see the big spike as a result of people picking up on and driving the conversation using hashtags, using the phrase Sharpiegate, and we'll talk about the dynamics that led to that big spike. So what we see with these narratives and the spread of these narratives is basically we go from concern to suspicion to accusation. And what we see on these slides is a conversation of suspicion. I don't know. They tell us it's okay, but they didn't do anything about it. They're not really answering my question. So we've moved now from just a tweet of concern to, is there something else going on here? We've been told that we should be concerned. Now we're seeing this. What's the dynamic here? How is this working? And then just out and out accusation, right? There's a conspiracy here. We warned you about this. These are larger accounts that picked up on it and said, yeah, this is rigged. So concern, suspicion, now straight up accusation that pulls it up into a larger narrative to have the conversation. And then other items or evidence are added to really fuel those claims, right? To fuel those suspicions. In this case, what you see with the arrow is this is the state of Arizona's ballot tracking system that tells you your ballot's received, your ballot's been processed, and what your ballot status is. And at the bottom, it says ballot status canceled, which is obviously concerning to a voter if they don't understand the process, because what that canceled refers to is the fact that this voter requested a ballot or received a ballot by mail, but chose to vote in person. And so the election office cancels the mail ballot because the person voted in person. So that canceled is specific to that mail ballot. But to a voter, to folks that don't and aren't intimately familiar with the process, they see canceled, they don't know whether that's referring to the ballot they just cast in person or the ballot they voted by mail. And so words and communication really matter in this case, because a lot of times we think folks are more familiar with the process than they really are, right? This is something they do, hopefully every year, a couple times a year, but realistically not always that often. And so they're not as familiar. And so in a place where transparency was being offered by the elections office, a ballot tracking system intended to provide information and confidence to voters, the ballot status canceled was grabbed onto for the larger narrative to say, see, they're canceling your ballot. You use a Sharpie, it bleeds through, your ballot gets canceled, your votes aren't going to be counted. And so what we see overall is an engagement and information that shows how the narrative goes viral, right? And what you see, the various shapes, whether they're rhombus or circles or squares, this is tracking from the Election Integrity Partnership. The bigger the circle, triangle, or square is the bigger the account. And so what you see is it starts with very small accounts. You can kind of see where Maricopa County responded. And as soon as that first big rhombus, that red rhombus at the bottom of the curve grabs on, it starts to spread to larger and larger accounts. And then it takes off and it kind of goes into the elbow of influence and virality death, right? At that point, when that rhombus grabs it and it takes off, no local election office, frankly, very few, if any, state election offices are going to be able to tamp that narrative down without help, without support from other trusted voices in the community, really pushing against the narrative and calling it out. There wasn't a lack of fact checking here. There was a lack of amplification of the facts and lack of amplification of the truthful information in comparison to the larger accounts that were spreading the information. So what can we do about this? What steps can we take? We're going to talk about that at the end, but the key for members of NCSL is twofold. One is engagement with your state and local election office. Many of you already do that, but go visit it. And when you go visit it, share the information that's shared. Share it on social media. Share it with your constituents that you went, you asked the questions that you had. They had answers, they have processes, they have procedures, they have checks. If you have concerns, share those with the local election office. They welcome those. I don't know a local election office that wouldn't welcome engagement from their representatives, from staffers and others to open up the process. Have open houses, attend pre-election testing. These are all opportunities that you all as trusted voices in your communities have. Share facts on your own web pages as part of remarks that you make in the public. Reinforce to people as you're out talking about the importance of participation in democracy, that you visited the office, that you've talked to the election officials, that we run it locally so that folks can interact with it, and that there are necessary controls in place to ensure the security, accessibility, and integrity of the election. That's really, really critical. Election offices are open. They want engagement in that way, and they really value your trusted voice in their community, talking about the good work that they do. So I'm going to hand it over to Colin to talk about, just as a quick heads up, and Colin, you should feel free, but the Digital Threat Analysis Center at Microsoft is a team that's dedicated to looking at the combination of cyber and information operations from adversaries to really look at the threat context. So that's the background Colin comes from, and I'll hand it over to Colin.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Mandy, as well. Yeah, as Matt mentioned, the Digital Threat Analysis Center at Microsoft is really aimed at looking at foreign threats to the U.S. information space and to information spaces worldwide. I'll just give you a little bit of background on who we are. I think maybe the best place to start is with our mission, which is to detect, assess, and disrupt digital threats to Microsoft, its customers, and democracies worldwide. And so in that context, I think we'll get into a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of foreign threats to the US midterm elections. Matt, we can jump to the next.
I'm trying. There we go.
Great. So when we're looking at potential foreign interference in U.S. elections, I think it's probably useful to bifurcate between presidential election cycles and midterm election cycles, because they're really about different things, and because they're about different things, there's different incentives for foreign powers to interfere. Presidential election cycles are about people and power. People is mainly the candidates. Power is who controls the country. Whereas midterm election cycles are about policy positions and are about money, so resource allocation. That drives sort of the outcomes for potential influence. So in presidential election cycles, we're talking about international alliances, we're talking about military disposition, we're talking about trade deals or the lack of trade deals. Whereas in midterm election cycles, we're talking about a little bit more along the margins. So favorable relations between countries, financial outcomes for individuals, et cetera, et cetera. And then that drives foreign states' interest in those elections and interest in meddling in those elections. And we'll sort of go through Russia, Iran, and China, Russia, China, and Iran. But very briefly, in presidential election cycles, Russia, as a great power, is interested in political warfare, is interested in its position vis-a-vis the United States on the world stage. Iran, principally and especially in the past sort of 10 or so years, is interested in its national security. And China, we really haven't seen meddle in presidential election cycles at all. In midterm election cycles, Russia wants to sustain its allies. Iran kind of wants to drive chaos. So Iran, both in presidential election cycles and midterm election cycles, we've seen try to divide the United States along sort of socioeconomic lines, racial lines, et cetera. And then increasingly, we've seen China in midterm election cycles look to play both on those sort of social levers as well as economic levers. We can flip to the next. So Russia is probably the one sort of foreign power that we're most concerned about when it comes to election interference. The most important thing I want you to take away from this slide, though, is that Russia is very distracted right now. Russia is prosecuting a war in Ukraine. It is a large country, but it's a country with very real resource constraints. And so we believe that sort of any IO campaigns, any influence campaigns that are going to be aimed at the United States elections are probably going to show significant overlap with Russian aims in Ukraine. And we've seen that on the narrative side already, right? So narratives that we've seen sort of pro-Russian outlets and Russian state outlets put forward include US expenditures on weapons to the Ukrainians. We've seen both in the United States and in Europe a focus on sort of this whole winter is coming. Where are you going to get your natural gas from, if not through Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2? And we've seen, over the past couple of years, really, a focus on sort of US military biological warfare laboratories that don't really exist being used to develop chemical and biological agents. And this is something that's been sort of really, really common on the sort of Russian fringe side of things. Another threat that we probably want to pay a little bit more attention to is these auxiliary pro-Russian cyber actors. And we see this on the Russian side of things. We also see this on the Iranian side of things. And so what does that mean? That means cyber-enabled influence operations, which is, in layman's terms, that's hack and leaks. So Russia has a very developed cyber capability, but one thing that a cyber capability can do that we don't often think about is create content, right? And so if a Russian cyber actor were able to access sort of US voter rolls, access the personal files of a politician, those could then be instrumentalized in a subsequent influence operation. We can go to the next one. One new thing this year is China entering the scene when it comes to election interference. Recently Meta put out a disclosure saying that China-based actors, this is not necessarily the government, but we can surmise maybe it was, had set up a series of accounts, sock puppet accounts that looked like US nationals and were pushing very divisive messaging on things like abortion and guns, right? So that's a new thing for China. It's a novel method, but it had very limited impact. So these didn't have a lot of followers, didn't have a lot of reach. But it's a little bit worrying that China-based actors, again, not attributing that to the government, saw fit to sort of enter the stage in this way. Sort of more traditionally, the ways that China has exerted itself during election cycles has been through inauthentic news websites targeting diaspora populations. So the Chinese speaking population may not be, among the larger populations in the United States, voting blocks in the United States, but they do exist in very large numbers in specific congressional districts, right? And a lot of those individuals consume Chinese news and use Chinese sort of social media applications, as well as other sort of mobile applications. That's things like WeChat and Weibo. An additional concern is the United Front Work Department. So again, this is part of the Chinese government that specifically targets diaspora communities. We've seen them do a couple of things. The first is, again, founding and signing information agreements with sort of news outlets. So like creating their own news outlets in the United States, or at least look like they're in the United States. It's not just the United States, right? It's all across Africa, all across Western Europe, into South America. It's really everywhere. And then we've seen another thing which has been a little bit less in the United States than it has been in places like New Zealand and Australia, which is attempts at elite capture. So persuading politicians, elected officials to the Chinese Communist Party line. And then lastly, Iran. So Iran, as I mentioned earlier, their main focus has been to sow discord. And similar to what we saw from the Chinese this time around, what they've done is basically position themselves as Americans with the Proud Boys campaign that happened a couple of election cycles ago, as well as subsequent efforts that we've seen in Israel. Like the Russians, the Iranians are probably also a little bit distracted now. Maybe fortuitously for us, the Israeli elections are happening on the 1st of November. Iran, like Russia, is a resource-constrained state. And so perhaps the influence that might have been planned for the United States election, some of that may have been diverted to the Israeli election, where we're really seeing, both on the cyber side and on the influence side, a lot more Iranian emphasis. Similar to Russia as well, Iran does have these sort of cyber-enabled influence capabilities. And so again, that's the hack and leak type of actors. And really what we've seen, especially in Israel, but also in the United States, is using things like social engineering and cyber operations to then drive their influence operations. And so we actually think Iran is probably one of the more likely actors to engage in election meddling this time around, especially on the off cycle, right? So the Russians maybe have grander aims when it comes to presidential election cycles. The Iranians we've seen in the past have been maybe a little bit more focused than others on the midterm election cycles. And I think that's probably the end of my slides, Matt.
Thank you, Colin. Mandy, we'll hand it back over to you to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, I have some questions that have come to me directly. So, I'm actually going to take the liberty to ask one of my own first. Moderator's privilege, I guess. So, Colin, you're talking about, big, powerful countries, right? And that's kind of overwhelming to hear if you are someone who's working in a small election office, right? That might only have a couple of full-time employees, maybe just one, maybe they're not even full-time, right? And so, Matt, I was thinking that too with your, you're just talking about the the overwhelming proliferation of MDM that circulates on social media and the role that a lot of election officials have in trying to respond to and rebut that. So I guess my question for both of you is, what can legislators do to assist election offices, election officials with these really kind of like grand like threats, right? They're big, they're pervasive, they're foreign, they're domestic, they're not bound by geography. What can our members do?
Yeah, I'll go first, and Colin, if you have additional ideas, please jump in. But there's three main things that I'd suggest for legislators. One is I already touched on, and that is engaging with your state and local election official. Many of you already do that. Many of you have to file paperwork, for instance, with your board of elections to run, things like that. And so ensuring that you have that interaction and that you make those conversations public. I've seen recently several local election officials hosting members of Congress, state legislators, mayors, others in delegations to the office to show them the controls, the policies, the procedures that are in place, and then encouraging those folks to share those out with their constituents. All of you are part of a trusted ecosystem of information to share that. The second is in response, as election officials always do, in response to sort of the ongoing campaign around denigrating our democracy that really started in 2016 with the Russians. State and local election officials have created FAQ sites, rumor control sites, fact sites, whatever you want to call them, to share information about how they secure the process, what policies and procedures are in place, items like that. And so just sharing those on your own social media channels, creating one-page handouts that could be shared as you go out and do town halls or office hours or things like that. We know many legislators are being asked questions because this is a big topic of conversation, and having that information readily available, and then the ability to say, and I've talked to, Cheryl in the Jackson County election office. She's wonderful. I encourage you to go talk with her as well if you have questions, or to serve as a poll worker, right? There's opportunities for constituents that have concerns to participate directly in the process in a very meaningful way. And then the third is really one about investment, and not just monetary investment, but supporting through skills and otherwise the needs of the election officials. The reality is state and local election officials remain both underfunded and undersupported. They need additional IT resources, both in the form of systems, but also in personnel. And so anything you could do to help support their asks for additional resourcing in the lead up to and after election day, heading into the next election. The reality is, as soon as they finish one election, they're on to the next one. And so that additional support legislatively that could be provided budgetarily, even just engaging with county commissioners and others that may fund elections at the local level as well, is incredibly important because they remain completely underfunded and understaffed in many places.
Thanks, Matt. Colin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just one small thing, which is, it may seem overwhelming that, we have all of these nation state adversaries with, substantial resources, all with the sort of aim to greater and lesser degrees of both either undermining our democracy or sort of driving social divisions. But I would just point to two things. One, I think especially the federal government has come a long way since 2016 in sort of identifying these threats, and then crucially making public sort of who's behind it, what types of narratives they're using to sort of debunk and pre-bunk a lot of these operations. And the second is, while some of them are fairly sophisticated, a lot of what we've been seeing here at DTAC has been ham-fisted, poor English, limited reach, etc. And so, while we're keeping a very close eye on it and preserving our democracy and preserving the integrity of our elections is top of mind, there's nothing to me that's sort of screaming like an existential crisis this time around.
Yeah, the one last thing, I'm sorry, that I would add is just remember, if you're being asked, about your own elections, so your own jurisdiction or another state, just remember those three buckets, right? Transparency, bipartisanship, professionalism exist across all 50 states, or requirements in the law in many cases across all 50 states. So those three things exist across the board.
Yeah, I think that's great to have just underlined triple times again. So I will note that in the chat for all the attendees, my colleague Sage is dropping in some NCSL resources. So election cybersecurity, actions for legislators, and then more on battling MDM, different tips for legislators. Again, these are valuable to anyone in the election space and legislative staff, whom I know we have a number on the call as well. You may find them very interesting, hopefully helpful and informative. So Colin, I have a question for you now. The question is, they're wondering if we're seeing an uptick in nation state attacks kind of nationally.
That's an interesting question. An uptick, perhaps not, perhaps so. It's really hard to quantify that. So I was obviously quite concerned that, it looks like a China-based actor now is interested in sort of meddling in one way or another in US politics. I think that's probably likely to continue to greater and lesser degrees. I don't think there's sort of a deluge of sort of foreign influence activities that we've noticed specifically around elections, no. But sort of a wider point is that, all of these nation state actors have very ambitious aims that don't always focus directly on the United States as well. So I would say overall, we're seeing an uptick, but specifically targeting the US and specifically targeting US elections. Again, hard to quantify, but not really seeing that, no.
I think that's a bit of good news, so we'll take it. All right.
That can change too, but yeah.
I know election days, there's still plenty of time for things to happen.
Well, and remember, they're perfectly happy to amplify ongoing narratives, existing narratives, right? And instead of just having to do the work themselves. So that's part of this calculus too, as we get close to election day and afterwards.
Yeah, Matt, actually, that's a perfect segue to the next question, unwittingly. So, you were talking about Sharpie Gate. You mentioned, of course, that there are other examples you could have used. And in the spirit of trying to pre-bunk mis and disinformation, what are the big MDM narratives that you're seeing ahead of this year's election?
Yeah, and I know DTAC's done some looking at this too. So Colin, feel free to jump in too. But from my perspective, it's three, and they're not surprising in that we've seen them before. Frankly, I've seen them in elections in even smaller forms for a number of years when we talk about them. And that's not by coincidence, obviously. People go back to what's familiar because people will engage with what's familiar, right? So if they've heard it, they've been exposed to it, they're more likely, or at least more likely to engage with it. So the first is narratives around the systems, right? Whether that's voting systems, electronic poll books, election night reporting, narratives around systems that support elections are one bucket that we've certainly seen and I would anticipate we'll continue to see. The second is narratives around results and how results change as more ballots are counted. So it was, in 2020 referred to as either the blue shift, however you want to term it, but the reality is in the vast majority of states, ballots are counted not just on election night, but after election night because of mail-in ballots, early voting ballots, items like that. And so it remains a narrative that's likely to be targeted, particularly in states where they cannot pre-process ballots. So Michigan is a good example of that, where they cannot prepare to process the mail ballots in advance, so it takes them longer to process and count them afterwards. That leaves that uncertainty available. Uncertainty is ripe for driving of narratives. And then the third is sort of around process changes or perceived process changes. We saw that in 2020 around changes that were made as a result of COVID, whether that was early voting sites and the way that early voting sites were managed, drop boxes, vote by mail. We saw narratives around that. And so places, if those changes either remain or there are additional changes, we should expect to see narratives around those changes.
Yeah, just to underline Matt's first point, and that's what we're seeing from sort of a lot of these foreign actors, which is an emphasis on driving perceptions of chaos or perceptions of sort of like a lack of competency from state and local elections, national elections, And I think it's just much easier for them rather than trying to find like a specific wedge issue and then driving that through the various sort of propaganda, disinformation, misinformation networks. It's much easier just to like try to knock the house down or sort of undermine its foundation. So that's definitely, at least on the Iranian side, what we see as well. They don't particularly like any of their options when it comes to US candidates. And so a much easier thing is just to say, the United States democracy is a flawed system in toto. And I think we've seen similar stuff from the Chinese as well. And, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, they all, claim to have democracies of one form or another. And I think it's very much in their sort of like grand strategic interest to sort of draw parallels between the way that they run their quote unquote democracies and the way that we run our democracy. When in reality, we know they're, night and day.
Yeah, the only other bucket that I'd add that I talked about actually is any place where there's a problem experience. So recently we saw a state that mailed some registration information to folks who were ineligible to register. Immediately saw narratives spring up around that mistake, right? And so we will continue to see where mistakes or anomalies take place, even if they're explained right away by the election official, that those narratives gin up and take off. And it really is on all of us, one, to understand the mistake and hold people accountable, if there are mistakes, but also make sure we share the information about the integrity, security of the election. The fact that those folks aren't eligible to register, won't get registered, doesn't change the fact a mistake was made, but it rebuffs the concerns about some of the narratives.
Yeah, that's all great. And actually, I just have one last question for you both. And it kind of relates to what was just being talked about too. So, kind of more about what is an effective debunk or pre-bunk, right? We hear all the time, our machines aren't connected to the internet, but is that enough to protect against, MDM around the vulnerability of cyber attacks, right? I know it's not necessarily an MDM question, it's kind of cyber hygiene too, but how to make those messages effective?
It is an MDM question. It absolutely is, and that's the thing that Colin and his team do such a good job. Cyber and information operations are inextricably linked. Our adversaries don't view them as separate, right? They use them together, and we need to view them as together, and so that they're absolutely linked. And I'll give an example from the 2020 election, and I suspect Colin could give the one from the Russia-Ukraine invasion, but in the lead up to the 2020 election, we saw the Iranians access voter information in a number of states that was publicly available, and use that information to contact voters to basically push a narrative of the Proud Boys know how you're voting. If you vote that way, there will be consequences. So to threaten, intimidate, kind of scare folks. States started reporting and local officials started reporting this to the federal government. The feds were able to take it and combine it with some intelligence and say, okay, one, we know this is the Iranians. Two, we know these narratives are false. We have secrecy of the ballot. People don't know how you voted. And three, we need to get out in front of this. And so within 27 or so hours of initial reporting from state and local officials, the federal government, in coordination with state and local officials, got out in front, held a press conference and said, the Iranians are targeting our election. Here's the activity. They sent text messages and emails. They had this video. It's all not true. It's all false narrative from the Iranians trying to undermine confidence in our elections. Don't buy it. Go participate in our democracy in the way that you see fit. And so that was a little bit responsive, but also pre-bunking in the sense that it got out in front before it really could take hold and said no. And we saw that Iranian campaign largely fail, just not get a whole lot of interaction from that. Colin, I don't know if you want to talk about the sort of Russia-Ukraine approach as well.
Yeah, one more general point, and then I can talk to Russia-Ukraine. The more general point is that there are some narratives that just because of the sad state of political polarization in this country, people are going to believe no matter what. I think particularly dangerously, there are some people who just believe that we can't have fair elections anymore. I don't think that's by any stretch of the imagination the majority. So I think, at the very least, what something like pre-bunking can do is work on the margins for those who maybe could fall into that trap or could fall into that mode of thinking, to give them some sort of armor and give them some facts to push back either with themselves or with others. That's the first thing. I think on the Russia-Ukraine side of things, I think the US government did a very good job of sort of saying, that we think the Russians are going to invade Ukraine, which really did sort of change the conversation and sort of sharpen the mind for a lot of people. And then in the specific case of the potential use of chemical and biological weapons by the Russians, which I think was largely driven by sort of intelligence assessments, I think probably had a real effect in sort of discouraging that use. So we can sort of port that into the information space as well. Sort of having a preemptive information strike against sort of misinformation, disinformation out there would be incredibly useful to hopefully either blunt the effect of an ongoing attempt or to forestall it entirely, right?
And this is where sharing the trusted sources of information, the state and local election official website, reiterating the information that's available to voters is really important, because if nothing else, as Colin said, it may slow someone down from interacting with a piece of information that's incorrect and allow them to say, wait, I know I've seen something. Let me at least go to that spot or go to that website or where I saw it, versus just falling down that rabbit hole of information because there's not something else available to them to look at, right? And so that's the challenge for all of us, is to continue to drive people to those sources of information, state and local election official websites that can provide what voters need.
I think what I'm hearing from both of you, the two of the most important things that can be done are to kind of get ahead of those narratives, right? Get the good information out there first so people encounter that before they encounter the kind of bad information. And then also that collaboration is incredibly important, right? Between legislators, election officials, state and federal governments, that those relationships can help mobilize a quick response to shut down some of these MDM narratives. So wonderful content. Thank you both so much. If anyone in attendance has any further questions, you can always reach out to us at NCSL. I'll throw my email in the chat. We can go to Matt and Colin for more details as needed. But thank you both for joining us. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And I hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Andy.